Welcome to the Working Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Pat Lencioni, and we are taking a short break this month. We have a lot of exciting things going on at the Table Group, so we've decided to take the month of July off and rerun some of our favorite episodes since we launched the podcast 3 years ago. But we'll be back with new episodes in August, and we hope you enjoy. God bless. Welcome to the Working Genius Podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by Cody Thompson, my co-host. Good afternoon, Cody.
Good afternoon, Pat.
We don't have Tracy with us. She's homesick today.
That's right.
So our adult supervision is Matt, my son. How you doing there, Matt? Matt nods his head. So it's just us, Cody. We're not even going to put suck in the title today, are we? What is the title of our podcast?
We were pretty good today. So our title today, Tracy, listen, drum roll, please. No suck in the title. Make your conversations more productive.
That's right. Make your conversations more productive. Because we recently came to the realization that your working genius is relevant to the kind of conversation you're having. And we really need to be aware of the nature of our conversations so that we can bring the appropriate geniuses that we have, or even people, and know how to edit ourselves when our genius is not necessarily appropriate for that conversation. And that's what we're going to talk today about, is what kind of conversation are we having and which geniuses are most appropriate for that.
Yeah, and we had previously done an episode on your genius and your meetings, and we'll touch on how there's some tangentially related, like sort of altitude type conversations that we have in the midst of this. But I think the reason we chose make your conversations more productive is because if you can contextualize the conversation you're having, and these are not, new ideas, these are types of conversations that happen in businesses every day. If you can figure out what the right context is and what geniuses lend themselves to that, and sort of bring people with that genius into those conversations, they will be more productive. And so if we were going to make a different title, it's like, hey, let's make our conversations not suck. And this is a way to make sure that they don't. And so let's chat about the 4 different types that you sort of pulled together, Pat, for this.
Right. And Cody, before I do that, I think you reminded me of something, and that is the stakes here are very high. Sometimes you're having a conversation with somebody, and because you have the different idea of what you're doing there, you can get really frustrated at people and judge them and feel frustrated because you're having 2 different conversations and you're bringing completely different geniuses to it, and it can be maddening. And until we clarify, hey, why are we actually in this conversation? We don't know at what level and what kind of talent we're supposed to be bringing to the table.
Totally. And I think that what's so interesting about this is like there's multiple layers to these things, which is we have talked before about having good conversations as it relates to conflict, but sometimes conflict comes about, because we're not sure what conversation we're having, or we're bringing different geniuses to the wrong conversation. So it's not a silver bullet. There's layers to all of this. But if you can start to parse through, hey, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? What type of conversation are we having? What geniuses lend themselves to that? And then in the midst of that, how do we have the right amount of conflict and trust in those conversations to make it as productive as possible? You can really see these dramatically improve.
Exactly. So let's talk about the first kind of conversation, Cody, and we call it brainstorming. Brainstorming. We all know what that means. It means we're trying to come up with ideas. We're thinking big. We're throwing things against the wall. We're trying to figure something out together in a creative, non-judgmental way. And when I say non-judgmental, I mean we can evaluate our ideas, but we are brainstorming. Everybody knows what that means. And there are 3, count them, 3 working genius types that really lend themselves to brainstorming. And those are wonder. People like, hey, I wonder if we should do this. What about this? And then invention, that seems like the one that's most centrally, and that's like, hey, I have an idea. I think I can solve that problem you're wondering about. And then discernment, where people are like, tell me more about that. I think that's a good idea. Or wait, I don't understand that part. Or, I think you need a little bit more work in that part. So WID is kind of the trifecta for brainstorming.
Right. And I think what's interesting is like the listeners of this podcast who are more familiar with their working genius, I bet you can divide the line when you're in a company or you're working on a project and somebody says, let's have a brainstorming meeting. I bet the people with WID are like, oh boy, yeah, that sounds fun. And the people with the GET geniuses are like, oh, really? That sounds like a waste of time, or I'm not as excited about that type of meeting. So it's interesting that we sort of instinctually, based on our genius, are drawn to these types of conversation. But I love what you said. Here's what I find really interesting about this WID conversation around brainstorming is we typically get in the room and it is about throwing a dozen ideas against a whiteboard or a wall and saying like, which of these really makes sense? And it's sort of interesting. I think we've used this language in companies before to say, hey, there are no bad ideas. There are no dumb ideas. But there's discerners in the room that are like, some ideas are better than others. Maybe there's not dumb ideas, but we're going to figure out what the best ideas are. And so that whole process really is, if you can keep that window in the wonder, like, what is the right question, or what is the right invention, or what are we missing with invention and then some discernment, you're going to have a really productive brainstorming conversation.
Exactly.
I think one distinction we could make, just to make sure we don't confuse anybody, is that somebody might say, oh, WI, that's ideation. Where is discernment coming into brainstorming? And as it fits in, like, it is a part of brainstorming because it's an asset to that conversation. It's evaluating the ideas, but it's not a part of ideation.
Right. It's still relevant. Now, Matt, you don't have I. That's not one of your working geniuses. You're a WD. So tell me about how you participate in a brainstorming conversation differently than I do.
I only evaluate, and often it comes across as criticism because I'm not the one generating any of the new ideas.
But the interesting thing is, when we're in a brainstorming session, you'll laugh and go, hey, sorry, I don't have a better idea. Here's why I don't think that will work. But at least we know you don't have I, you have W and D. You're still really inherently involved in that conversation, but we're not expecting you to come up with the I.
Yeah, I remember in that conversation we had yesterday or 2 days ago, I said, I hate criticizing an idea without offering an alternative. And I think it was you or Tracy that said, that's just your geniuses.
Right. No guilt there.
You said you just evaluate in those meetings, and I don't think that's true, Matt. I think what you do also, the way your wonder comes in, and you did it 5 minutes before this podcast. In fact, let's let listeners in on how we do this. 5 minutes before the podcast, we try to name the podcast, which is like, what's the title? And what you do really well, Pat will throw out ideas, and you and I use our discernment to evaluate them. But what you do that I don't have wonder, you say, well, what is the thesis of this? You actually ask the right questions so that we're sort of getting at the right title. Whereas I just am throw out some more, Pat. I don't feel like that's the right one. So the wonder part of that, it doesn't necessarily happen in sequence all the time, because an inventor might throw out an idea, and a wonderer, and we have a consultant who's great at this too, Krista, who's a WD, just like you, Matt, and she'll be like, what question are we solving? Have we asked the right question first? So that's all in that WID mix. It's not just evaluation, it's asking the right question.
Right. And brainstorming is fun. Now, as you said before, though, if a GET, a person with a GE or an ET or a GT or whatever else, if they come to a brainstorming session, it is very tempting and natural for them to go, gosh, this feels like a waste of time. Can we just get on with it and make a decision? Whereas if we know we're having a brainstorming meeting, we can say to that person, hey, it's okay, obviously, that you're here. We know this might be frustrating to you, but try to bear through it because we need to do this. Your will come. But if they don't know that about themselves or about the nature of the conversation, they feel like they're going to add value by saying, yeah, good enough, wrap this up.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because my geniuses are DG, and you guys are squarely, Matt, you're WD, Pat, you're ID. I do find myself, even in these naming conversations before, I'm like, that's good enough. Let's just do this thing. Like, that's fine. And it's sort of my two geniuses in tension with each other. I'm partly in the, I want to find the right thing, but I'm also partly in the galvanizing phase of let's just go,
And the key to this is being intentional and aware of what kind of meeting is this? What are my geniuses and how do they correspond?
Right.
So let's go to the next type of meeting, which is decision making. And sometimes you brainstorm and it flows right into decision making, and you got to go, hey, I think we're in decision making mode now. And these require different geniuses, right?
Mm-hmm.
The primary one is D, discernment. We know that. But even in decision making, there's still a little bit of I going on because they might go, "Ooh, is there a better way to do this?" And then there's the G going, "Hey, if we're going to make this decision, I got to understand this because we're going to eventually have to rally people around it." But it's primarily a discernment activity.
Yep.
But it's different than brainstorming, which is why what we're doing is essentially leaving the W behind and adding the G, if you will.
Yeah. And I even love the language around that because brainstorming does feel more like how would you describe it? Not an active activity. In other words, like you don't leave a brainstorming meeting necessarily with action. You
Right.
leave it with ideas and possible solutions. And then what comes next is it makes sense that G is involved in the decision-making side because that's where the brainstorming conversation moves into action. And so you leave the room maybe with a handful of ideas or solutions that you've distilled down. And then when we're making a decision, it's like, okay, what are the final tweaks? And then let's get moving.
Yeah. And we're not saying that a person who doesn't have ID or G can't be in a decision-making meeting, but it's not going to be their favorite kind of meeting.
Yep.
And they probably will have to say, "Hey, I'm going to let others lead here. I will provide input, but I realize this is not my genius."
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. Then we move into the next kind of meeting, which is launch, which is now we've got to actually get this off the ground and get people excited about this. And of course, this is the galvanizers. This is their place to be. They love this. This is their moment in time, their stage. But it still involves D and E because the D needs to be there as people go, "I don't understand. What about this?" And the Ds are very good at like evaluating that. And the E's, well, you don't galvanize something without somebody there to receive it. They're like, "Please galvanize me. Tell me what we're trying to do. Get me excited and I'll come along and help." So this is a DGE meeting, but it really centers around the G.
Yeah. And I think if you think about this, launches are such a great concept or word for this type of conversation. It tends to, I would bet that the people that are thinking about like, what does that actually look like in my company? There are like all hands meetings where we're rolling something out and there's a galvanizer maybe at the front of the room saying, "Here's what we're going to do." And really and as a DG, I've been in rooms where I feel like we're launching something and there aren't enough E's in the room. And I feel like I'm galvanizing to an empty auditorium. And I'm like, "Oh no, we're hosed." You need the enablement people to come alongside and say, "We're on board." And there's something sort of intrinsic and feedback for the galvanizer when you see the enablers start to like get momentum around the idea.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have that, it can fall flat.
Yeah. I mean, and so that's critical. The other thing is if you have a WI in the room, and we love WIs, and you're going, "Okay, here we are, we're ready to go. We're going to launch this." And they go, "Hey, wait a second. I was just thinking, do you think maybe instead of this, we should do it's like this? That meeting is over."
Totally.
But a WI will be comfortable doing that right up till the end.
Yep.
And frankly, I'm an ID, and that's tempting for me too. And that's why we have to know, we're done brainstorming. We've made our decision. Now what we need to do is get this going and off the ground.
Yeah.
And so that's where D, G, and E comes in.
This is where it does, if you've listened to all the podcasts that we've done on this feed, that it does kind of harken back to the elevation conversation where we kind of need to know what elevation we're at because that's how you make conversations productive or meetings productive or an initiative productive. But this is a little bit more nuanced because again, we're not saying, "Hey, when you're launching something, anyone who doesn't have D, G, or E shouldn't leave the room." That's not the point.
No.
The point is you should be pretty aware of the fact that you need those type of people in that conversation. Otherwise, you're going to be really frustrated by the end of it. The same way you'd be frustrated in a brainstorming session if you went in to say, "Let's come up with a bunch of ideas, potential ideas," and you had the wrong geniuses in there. It's totally natural, but going in with this context is going to make your conversations feel more productive.
Yeah. We worked with an executive team once, and essentially they really struggled at brainstorming, and they had no one on their team with wonder or invention as geniuses other than their lawyer.
Yeah.
And they had to say, "We got to let him play a more active role in this process. We have to defer to him because he's actually interested in these new ideas. And we're so chomping at the bit to get started executing things that we're missing that brainstorming part. And so when you turn to the people that are good at that and you go, we're going to give you permission to do that. And we're going to hold back in trying to get you to shorten that time frame.
You know, Pat, I'm going to let us finish this last type of conversation, but I just had a question I'm going to ask you, and I want to say it out loud so you remind me to ask you, but it's about how you might go about determining why a conversation is frustrating. So after we get through this last one, let me ask that. I just want to I'll forget it if I don't say it right here.
Good. I'm glad you put it out there because both of us would. Okay, the last kind, and I was just thinking as we were talking, let's say we spend 15% of our time brainstorming, and then 15% of our time actually making the decision, and then 15% of our time getting people excited and launching it. That's 45%. The last kind of conversation is 55% of the work. I think it really is. And that's called like reviewing our status and clearing out obstacles. In other words, this is like getting it done and saying, how's it going? And what stands in the way? How's it going? What stands in the way? How's it going? This is what, when we're getting the work done and stepping back to say, what's the progress? This is more of the time than all of the others combined. I really do think. And this is where the right geniuses in the room are G, E, and T. G, E, which spells get, like get things done, but G, E, and T. Now, think about that. G, E, and T is so critical, but it's so important that we bring it in at the right part and in the right kind of conversations. This is where people with G, E, and T will say, hey, Mr. WI or Mrs. ID, it's okay if you come to our meeting, but remember what kind of meeting this is. It's a status check and an obstacle clearing conversation. It's not a brainstorming session. We're not revisiting the decision, and we're not relaunching this project. And I think this is where people that like to get things done want to make sure they don't get thrown off and we don't constantly move backward. And so it really depends on knowing what kind of conversation you're having. And here's what I want to tell people that are listening. When you sit down to have a conversation with somebody or you're halfway through it, check with each other and say, hey, well, by the way, what kind of conversation is this? Are we brainstorming? Are we trying to make a decision? Are we trying to get this off the ground, or are we executing this and we're supposed to be focused on that? If you don't know what kind of conversation you're in, it's going to be a crapshoot whether or not it's a productive one.
I don't think there's any organization that can luck into that. Having the right people in the right conversations.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You have to be intentional. You have to raise that question. What kind of conversation are we having? And this is different than the meetings because like you can have an offsite meeting. That's one of our meetings. But during that meeting, you might do some brainstorming. You might actually solve some problems. You might actually talk about launching something. And during a strategic session, you might doing brainstorming. You might be doing decision making. So all of these can play out in different kinds of meetings.
Yep.
We have to ask ourselves, even within the context of a given meeting, this conversation that we're in right now, which kind of a conversation is it?
Yep. And I love what you said, Pat. The idea that the galvanizing enablement tenacity meeting, this obstacle clearing meeting, is 55% of the, or not meeting, conversation, is 55% of that workload. Because I think more than anything, I love reiterating the idea that this is not a one-time event. In fact, most of the time, this is a reoccurring conversation over the course of weeks and months until we've executed this plan. And whereas some of these other things can be sort of a moment in time, like a conversation around brainstorming happens once, we walk out of the room with ideas. A conversation that is obstacle clearing and status review, that's going to be an ongoing thing until our tenacity folks actually get the project done, like till we galvanize enablement and tenacity and finish. So it is really important for us to keep in mind that some of these things happen in a moment in time and others happen reoccurring over the course of time.
And let me just be very clear. I don't have any geniuses in G, E, or T. Two of my working frustrations are in that G, E, T. They're E and T. So nobody could be less appropriate for status review and obstacle clearing than me. Does that mean I shouldn't go to those meetings? No. It means I should go to those meetings being completely aware that if I just give in to my natural tendencies, I'm going to disrupt that meeting and not add value. I can add value, but only if I realize this is not the most natural thing for me. I have to be really intentional and kind of check myself when I drift into the things I prefer to do rather than what's needed.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask my question to you, Pat.
Yeah.
So here's the ideas. I think it goes back to this sort of layered concept that we talked about at the beginning, which is, let's say someone came to you and said, I just had a really frustrating conversation. So
Right.
not a productive one. I had a frustrating conversation. And you were going to try to do some forensic analysis for why this is frustrating. So I'm thinking about, and I don't want to preload your answers, but what would you do? How would you sort of dissect this and say, let me figure out why this is frustrating for you?
I love it. I love this. So I would say, who are you talking to and do you trust them?
Yep.
And if they said, oh, no, I don't trust them and they always annoy me, then I'm like, okay, we've got our answer.
Yep.
But if they said, no, it was Fred and I love Fred. We usually do great together, but that was so frustrating. Then I would say, okay, so what were you trying to do in the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
And they would say an answer, and I would say, were you both completely aware of that? And then I would just say, tell me how you annoyed one another. And oftentimes it will come down to really well-intentioned people trying their best to add value to whatever process you're doing, but using different tools and not really understanding. One person's trying to screw in the screw, one person's trying to hammer it in. It's like, well, are we supposed to be turning this or are we supposed to be pounding it? And if the answer is like, it doesn't matter, actually, it does matter because one is going to be destructive, one is not, and it depends on the job at hand.
That's almost exactly what I was thinking is like, the first layer is, do you trust that person? Because if you don't, then that conversation could be frustrating for a variety of reasons. It's, like you said, conflict without trust is politics. So it might be frustrating because we didn't trust each other. We were arguing, but at the end of the day, I wanted to win or you wanted to win. That might be one of the reasons this is frustrating. And then you go a layer deeper and it's like, oh, well, did we have the right conversation in mind? Were we trying to accomplish the same thing? I love the way you put that, because if I'm in a meeting as a DG and I'm trying to do decision making, galvanizing, and somebody else who's well intentioned is a tenacity person, and they're arguing tactics for completing the thing, we could walk away. And like you said, we're both well intentioned. That could be a really unproductive, frustrating conversation.
Right.
So it's super helpful to know. It's almost two layers, right? Or three layers. The trust piece. What are you trying to accomplish? And who are you as a person in terms of working genius? And know how you're going to show up to that conversation, and know whether you're adding value to that type of conversation or where you might naturally disrupt that type of conversation.
You know what I thought about that quote, Cody? One man's trash is another man's treasure.
Mm-hmm.
And like brainstorming is treasure for me.
Yep.
And bring somebody who doesn't like to do that, and they're going to buzzkill. They're going to crush my fun. They're going to be like, and I'm going to go, what would be great is if we tried this. They go, well, that'll never work. We don't have the budget for that. Think about how much time that's going to take. You're like, no, I don't need that. And then I go to their treasure, which is the implementation meeting where they're trying to figure out what's going on. And that to me is my trash. And I'm like, I don't even know why you're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
What's the purpose of all this? And I'm buzz killing their meeting. And they're like, dude, that's not what we need here today. And so it really just depends on, do we know why we're there, what we're doing? And we're honoring that rather than our own desire in that moment.
Yeah, I love it. I think that this would make, I'm even thinking about conversations I had this week where had I gone in with this level of intentionality, how much better they would have gone. So it is even helpful as we're talking about this. I'm like, boy, if I went in thinking, oh, that's actually a brainstorming conversation, who's in the room? Let me be prepared and aware about how that might go if these certain players are in the room. That's going to make it way better.
This happens all the time at home. My poor wife, Laura, she's a WI, and I'm usually in tactical mode when I'm at home. We got we got to pick up the kids, we got to do this, we got to do that. And sometimes she'll say something, and I'll give her an answer that's just like, I'm discerning, or even worse yet, I'm just trying to solve it to get it off the plate. And she just wanted to brainstorm.
Yeah.
But because it happens in the kitchen while we're doing the dishes or right before we go to bed, I don't even check on that. And sometimes she'll go, oh, I didn't need your advice. I just thought I would throw that out there. And, oh, I'm sorry. So even in our personal relationships, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing here?
Absolutely. I think that's all. Matt, I almost got disoriented when you came on. So I love that you jumped in and added, it's been a few weeks before you hit that unmute button. I love it.
I know WDs second guess themselves, but every time you weigh in, we like it. So thanks, Matt. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius podcast. God bless.